Starting off this countdown, we have Ancient Egypt. Psychiatrist Brian Weiss wasn't a believer of past lives until he met Catherine, a patient of his. Catherine didn't believe in past lives either, but during their sessions, Catherine started remembering hers, so they both tried past life regression. This allowed Catherine to remember one of her past lives in great detail. She remembers living in ancient Egypt and embalming mummies. She said, and I quote, "We put the bodies in brine for 30 days. They dry out and the parts are taken out. We are wrapping bodies. The soul passes on. You take your belongings with you to be prepared for the next and greater life." From then on out, she became fascinated with ancient Egypt. She even went on a museum's guided tour for their Egyptian exhibit and was able to correct the tour guide whenever they were wrong, and also answered any question that anyone had. This made both Brian and Catherine a huge believer of past lives, and Brian started to undergo past life regression as well so he could remember his. In our ninth spot, we have the reincarnation of Princess Diana. This one is pretty wild, folks, but in 2013, psychic Sharon Prasad claimed that Princess Diana was back in our world. She had been reincarnated. Want to know who she believes Diana got reincarnated to? Of course you do. She believes Prince George is the reincarnation of Princess Diana. That's right, Prince William and Kate Middleton's child. Now, why does she believe this? Well, for starters, both Prince George and Princess Diana were born in July, making them Cancers. Not only that, but Prince William has said that George reminds him a lot of his mother. They both have very similar interests and talents, like their love for dancing. Maybe it's just in their genes, or maybe it's reincarnation, or maybe it's Maybelline. Moving on to number 8, we have the Tibetan Lama. In 1991, a boy named Sonim Wangdu was born. 2 years later, odd things began to happen to him. He would get visions of his past life and knew all about the life of the Tibetan Lama Deshung Rinpoche. Well, it turns out that this kid was the reincarnation of the Tibetan Lama himself. In fact, he's so powerful that the Lama has been reincarnated a number of times. 4 times so far. In fact, the third reincarnated Lama, a year before his death, said, and I quote, "I will be reborn in Seattle." Well, where was Wangdu born? Seattle. Now, it's believed that one of the reasons you will keep reincarnating is if you have unfinished business left on Earth. I think the Tibetan Lama wants to continue on with his teachings and help others, which is why he is constantly reincarnated.
In our number 7 spot today, we have James Leninger. James Leninger was only 4 years old when he began to recount events from his past life. He swore that he had been a World War II pilot that had been shot down over Iwo Jima. These memories first came back when James' parents found him one night after he had woken up from a nightmare yelling, "Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out." James explained that his name in his past life was also James, and that he had flown an aircraft called the Natoma. His parents did some research after these claims and found out that there was an aircraft carrier during World War II called the Natoma Bay, and there was a pilot who had been killed in action in this plane over the Pacific named James Houston. They began to ask him questions about his past life, including questions about the airplane that would be truly surprising for a small child to have answers to, like when his mom referred to an object on the bottom of a toy plane as a bomb, and James responded by correcting her, telling her it was a drop tank. Or when one day they were all watching a documentary on the History Channel, and the narrator of the show referred to a plane as a zero, and James said that was untrue and it was actually a Tony. I have no idea what any of this means, but apparently James was right both times. This is obviously a pretty unbelievable story, and many people think that James just took an interest in World War II and planes at a young age and had somehow been exposed to this information previously, but his parents swear that that just isn't true. In our number 6 spot today, we have Jim Jones. Jim Jones is certainly one of the most well-known people on this list for all of the wrong reasons. He is the man who claimed that he was a reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, and Gandhi. That's a record. And he also founded the cult, which was originally called Wings of Deliverance, but he later changed the name to the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. After an expose in the New West magazine about the things going on in this cult, he ended up moving the group from the United States to Guyana. From here, there were claims of horrible things and human rights violations, which led to an investigation. People found out that some of the supposed members of this cult were actually being held against their will. What a surprise. In the end, with all of this going on, Jim managed to convince his followers to take all of their lives in one massive, horrific event, and this day has gone on to become known as the Jonestown Massacre. total of 918 people died that day, including Jim himself. In our number 5 spot today, we have Jeffrey Keane. Jeffrey Keane had lived a lot of his life and was already retired when he started to believe in his past life. Jeffrey and his wife went on vacation to Maryland when they visited a battlefield from the Civil War that was called Sunken Road, and that is when he became overwhelmed with emotion. Apparently, the emotion was so strong that he truly thought he might have been having a heart attack. After this emotion passed and he was able to gather himself, he still felt an unbelievable connection to this place. At a later date, he encountered a psychic at a party and had relayed this history to them. The psychic asked if he believed in reincarnation, and Jeffrey felt like he had to reply with the words, quote, "not yet." After this day, Jeffrey was reading a Civil War magazine when he came across a Civil War general named General Gordon. General Gordon had fought at Sunken Road, and during this battle he was known for constantly shouting the words, quote, "not yet." This of course caused Jeffrey to do more research into the general, where he found out even more connections, such as how on his 30th birthday, Jeffrey had to go to the hospital with a random, really terrible jaw pain, and when General Gordon was 30, he was shot in the jaw. Or how General Gordon had suffered certain injuries and Jeffrey had unexplained marks on his body in the same spots. This could all be a coincidence, but it definitely is a very interesting story regardless. In our number 4 spot today, we have Alan John Miller. Alan is an ex-software manufacturer turned founder of the Jesus cult. Alan himself claims that he is actually the reincarnation of Jesus, and his partner is the reincarnation of Saint Mary Magdalene. Thank goodness these two were able to somehow find each other. Alan holds, quote, divine truth seminars where he teaches what he refers to as the divine love path, which focuses mainly on emotional clearing. Alan has even gone as far as to give doomsday predictions, which he said could start as early as 2012, which, I mean, 10 years later, we all know simply did not happen. Alan believes that the movement of tectonic plates will cause severe earth changes, and they will result in a dramatic rise of the oceans. Apparently on his website he said, quote, both the east and west coasts of Australia will be underwater about 100 meters deep. In our number 3 spot today, we have Michael Trevesser. Also known as Wayne Bent, this guy was the leader of what is called as the Lord Our Righteousness Church in New Mexico. In 2000, he claimed that he himself was the Messiah. He predicted that the world would end in 2007, which again, I can confirm was not true, and he stated that God had said to, quote, stay with me one more year, but a year later he was arrested for some of the most horrific crimes that I cannot even mention here on YouTube. Not only this, but he also admitted and acknowledged doing similar crimes before in the past, like it was just no big deal. He then went on to compare himself to Jesus Christ, and he told the media, quote, the current upheaval over me and the present contest is well underway. It was the same for Jesus. Jesus had not committed any crimes, so the authorities had to invent some crimes to crucify him over. It is the same for me also. I have committed no crimes, but many crimes are being imagined and concocted in the minds of men to try and kill me again. In our number 2 spot today, we have Sergey Benhayan. Sergey is an Australian bankrupt tennis coach who believes he is the reincarnation of famous Italian artist and scientist Leonardo da Vinci. This would be fine, except Sergey is also the founder of a pretty harmful cult called Universal Medicine, which has been criticized for its extremely unorthodox practices and the fact that he has zero medical qualifications, the most important part. He not only has some extremely creepy and questionable practices that he says led to the curing of cancer, but his relationship workshops that cost tens of thousands of dollars have mostly led to divorce. How surprising. He also involves his daughter Natalie, and she claims that she can communicate with a woman's ovaries. No thank you. Do not talk to them. A New South Wales Supreme Court jury even found that it was true that he leads a socially dangerous and socially harmful cult. In our number 1 spot today, we have James Gibson. A man named James Gibson has an extremely troubled past and is actually a killer, which is truly never good, but he also believes that he is the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. I feel like even if you really felt like this, that might just be one secret that I personally would keep to myself forever, but James, I guess, feels a little differently. James really did have a difficult childhood and upbringing, which is quite sad. He lost his dad at a young age to the Black Saturday bushfires and had quite a troublesome time as a teenager. In 2015, he attacked and killed a man named Glenn Sullivan, and when asked why he did it, he said, quote, he killed my dad. I saw it in the smoke. James explained to his psychiatrist about his reincarnation belief, and he also explained that the German soldiers were controlling him and and had ordered him to kill someone so that they could find him and recognize him so that they could come and retrieve him. All in all, James has obviously had a rough go. The things he's done cannot be excused, but I do hope he has received some help and maybe some treatment for everything he's got going on.
Starting off at number 10, we have the Russian kindergartner. Now, this story surrounds a girl who was Russian in her past life. Her mother claims that when her daughter was learning the alphabet, she kept mixing up her letters. She would mix up her B's and V's and H's and N's. These letters aren't that similar, so it left her and her teacher confused, especially since her daughter kept saying, "I don't remember those." This little girl then states that she remembers the letter H and that it makes an N sound. Then she said that she knew more letters and began to write out the Russian alphabet. Her mom asked her where she learned that, and she said, "Vlad taught me before he disappeared," and not Vlad the vampire. This little girl claimed that Vlad was her brother in her past life. How freaky! Like, there's no way that this young girl just happened to know the Russian alphabet, unless it was from her past life. At number 9, we have the daughter who just wants to go home. This mother claims that when her daughter was young, she kept begging her mom to take her home. When she asked where her home was, she said that she used to live near the water with her other family. That was until one day she passed away. She would even draw pictures of her past home and retell memories of her watching the waves. She also refers to her mom as Pa and wants to go back home to her other Mahi. Moving on to number 8, we have The Boy and the Scottish Pub. Just like the title suggests, this story takes place in a pub in Scotland. When a 4-year-old and his family stopped at a pub in a small village in Cairngorms, the little boy recognized the pub immediately and said, "My favorite place." The boy was able to direct his dad to the bathroom in the pub, which was said to be hidden behind a wall and not even labeled. Then the little boy kept saying how much he loved this pub and sitting beside the fire. But there was no fireplace, but the boy insisted that there used to be one against a certain wall. Then he continued to talk about more details of the pub and about the owner and his friend Fred. Bar staff then said that his claims were correct. Fred was the owner there, but passed away 10 years ago. Okay, wow. Either this kid has been sneaking out and partying it up at this pub, or he truly did go there in his past life.
Next up at number 7 now, guys, we have The Fire. This is the story of Luke Ruhlman, a 5-year-old boy who claimed to have lived a past life as Pam Robinson, an African-American woman from Chicago who died in a fire at the Paxton Hotel in 1993. It all started when Luke was just 2 years old. He would talk about a woman called Pam. Eventually, his mother asked him who this Pam woman was. He said he used to be her, but then he died and went to heaven. He saw God, and then eventually God pushed him back down and he was a baby, and then he was named Luke. More details came later. Luke's mother investigated all of this and found Pam Robinson, one of the 19 people who died in the 1993 hotel fire. Luke said that was him. I encourage you guys to read the full story and see for yourselves if there is anything to Luke's story of reincarnation. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Shanti Devi. When this Indian woman was 4 years old, she told her parents that her real home was in Mathura, where her husband lived. Now Mathura was about 90 miles from her home in Delhi. Her parents tried to ignore her story, which frustrated Shanti so much that she ran away from home at the age of just 6 years old. She was trying to reach Mathura but was taken back before she could get there. She kept telling details of her past life though, telling people that she used to be married and that she died 10 days after giving birth to her child. Eventually her headmaster at school found a man in Mathura who said this story matched that of his wife who had died. Her name was Ludgi Devi. He too became convinced that Shanti Devi was the reincarnation of his wife. Shanti never married and continued to tell her story for the rest of her life. Coming in at number 5 now, we have the murder. Karanfil Tutuzmus was 2 days away from the birth of her son in 1958 when she had a dream one night. In the dream, she saw a man whose face was covered in blood entering her room. She asked him why he had come and told him to leave as her husband was away. He told her that his name was Salim Fesley and that he had been shot in the ear. When she awoke, Karanfil remembered hearing about a man just like that in a nearby village who had been accidentally killed. She told her husband about the dream. Her husband said he actually used to know the man. The boy was born, and as soon as he began to talk, he insisted that he was the reincarnation of the man in the dream. Except he claimed his death had been no accident and that he had actually been murdered. At the age of 4, he went to the village and talked with the man's widow. He recounted their life together and told the woman that he, the reincarnation of her husband, had not been killed in a hunting accident, he had been murdered. The widow and her children visited the boy as he grew up and very much believed that he was the reincarnation of the man they all knew. Moving on to number 4 now, we have solving a murder. There wasn't too much to go on with this story, but I'll give it a shot anyway. In 2015, it was reported that a 3-year-old boy from Golan Heights had a long red birthmark on his head. He claimed that he had been murdered in a past life, that the mark was a sign of his murder. Dr. Eli Lask investigated the case. When they went to a city, the boy recalled his original first and last names and the names of his murderer. A local overheard all of this and said that the name of the man who the boy claimed to be had actually gone missing 4 years earlier. The boy was then able to find his old home. He walked right up to a man nearby and said, "I used to be your neighbor. We had a fight and you killed me with an axe." The man turned pale and the boy continued, "I even know where you buried my body." The boy led them to the burial site and also found where the axe was hidden. The man then confessed to the murder. Incredibly, the location on the man's skull where the murderer's axe hit was exactly the same place as the boy's birthmark. Next up at number 3 now, we have Anne Frank. Barbro Karlin was born in Sweden in 1954 to Christian parents. Around the age of 3, she told her parents that she was not Barbro, but actually Anne Frank. She stopped acknowledging them as her real parents and told them that her real parents would come and get her soon. As she got older, she told them details of her life as Anne. Around age 7 or 8, she became very confused when her school teacher began talking about Anne Frank in class. She wondered how the teacher could know all these things about her. That's when she found out that Anne Frank was already a very famous person by then who had lived before, a victim of the Holocaust whose diary became one of the most important books in history. When she visited Amsterdam for the first time, she walked straight to Anne Frank's house without directions. Inside the house, she was stricken with anxiety. She broke out into a cold sweat and grabbed her mother's hand. She told her mother that the movie star pictures were still on the wall. Her mother couldn't see any of these. That's when one of the tour guides told them that they had been taken down for the day to be mounted on glass and put back up. The story goes on and on. There have been countless books written about it if you're still interested to hear more, and it really is interesting. Moving on to number 2 now, guys, we have the Pollock twins. Mr. and Mrs. Pollock were a couple who lived in Hexham, England. In 1957, tragedy struck when their daughters Joanna, aged 11, and Jacqueline, aged 5, were killed in a car accident. Their parents were devastated. A year went by and Mrs. Pollock became pregnant. To their surprise, she gave birth to identical twin girls. They named them Gillian and Jennifer. Although they were identical, they had different birthmarks. Jennifer had a birthmark on her waist that looked just like a birthmark that Jacqueline had. She also had a birthmark on her head that looked like another one of Jacqueline's scars. The family moved when the twins were just 3 months old. 2 years later, the girls started asking for toys that belonged to their older sisters, even though they had never seen these toys before. Eventually, the family returned to Hexham. Despite being too young to remember that town, the girls knew all of the landmarks that only their sisters should have known. They were also scared of moving cars and kept telling their parents the car is coming to get them. After the age of 5, these memories began to fade and the girls led normal lives. And finally at number 1 now, we have Nazi Al-Danaf. In 2000, this boy's story was studied by Dr. Haraldsson, a psychologist from the University of Iceland. At the age of 1.5, he told his mother, "I am not small, I am big. I carry 2 pistols, I carry 4 hand grenades. I am a fearless, strong person. Don't be scared by the hand grenades, I know how to handle them. I have a lot of weapons, my children are young, and I want to go see them." The guns and grenade talk was pretty shocking as it was, but his parents didn't even know that he knew these words at this age. The boy also showed an unusual interest in cigarettes and whiskey. He asked them if he could go back to his hometown, which was 10 miles away. They had never been there. When they arrived, he directed them to a house and then jumped out of the car. He ran ahead with his father while his mothers and sisters talked to a local and told them about Nazi's reincarnation story. The man was stunned. The details matched his deceased father's story exactly. When Nazi returned, the man asked him questions about the house, which he all got correct. He got details about the family's history completely right too. He even found weapons on the property that he had stashed in his past life. They showed him a picture of the man who had died and asked Nazi who it was. He said, "This is me. I was big, but now I am small."
Coming in at number 10, we have the incense maker. The case of the incense was so intense that it ended up being studied by a psychology professor at the Faculty Society Science at the University of Iceland. The story goes that a girl called Panima Ekanyake from Sri Lanka, who would talk about her previous life from the moment that she could talk, basically was adamant that she'd lived before. At 4, she saw a temple in a different region of town on the television and claimed to her parents that she'd lived nearby, despite never having been there. The things that she would say got weirder and weirder as she got older. She told her mother that she had another mother and father and that she worked in an incense factory, but she died in a bus accident. I know kids say some weird things, but this does seem pretty specific. Panima had 2 birthmarks, and she said that they were where the bus had run her over in a previous life, causing her injuries. One day her mother was sad about a person dying in a car accident, to which she tried to comfort her, saying that she died in a car accident too, but she'd been brought there. Weird. Eventually her parents became convinced that their daughter had lived a previous life, which was when the psychology professor got involved. In his research, he managed to trace the incense factory that the girl said that she'd worked at, and he discovered that the person she identified with in her previous life was a man. He found the man's brother, the factory owner, who confirmed that his brother did die in a bus accident while bringing incense from market. Now this was 2 years before the little girl's birth. The professor brought Panima and her family to the town, which they had never been to, but of course the girl recognized. She met the man who may or may not have been her brother in a previous life and immediately recognized him. He was actually really freaked out by her, but she managed to win him around. She knew so much detail about his life, and also she knew exactly how to make incense, despite that not being a skill that she'd ever been exposed to. When the brother saw her birthmarks in the exact spot that his brothers had succumbed to his injuries, he became a believer. Another story of brothers at number 9. Things are getting even weirder. This is the story of the Christiansen brothers, and it is so strange and somewhat unsettling. So Patrick Christiansen was born in Michigan in March 1991. He was the light end of a dark tunnel for his parents, who had lost a child called Patrick, aged just 2, 12 years prior. Patrick was born like any normal baby, but as he started to grow, doctors noticed that things were not quite right. He walked with a slight limp and developed a nodule on his scalp, which he had biopsied. Sadly, it was discovered that he had cancer and he was given chemotherapy. Now this left him with scars to the right hand and on his neck. Sadly, he died shortly after his 2nd birthday. His parents obviously were devastated. 12 years later, enter his brother Patrick. Now, Patrick had very strange birthmarks in similar spots that his brothers had scars. When he grew a bit, his parents found that he was walking with a limp, but doctors found that there was actually nothing wrong with him. When he was 4 years old, he told his mother that he wanted to go back to the orange and brown house, a house eerily matching a description of the family's old home that he'd never been to, but his brother had lived in. As he could talk more, he asked his mother if she could remember when he had surgery. She was baffled. She said he'd never had surgery, but then he pointed to a place where his brother had had his biopsy. It certainly seems as if Patrick was living Kevin's memories. We have a very strange story at number 8. We have The Choice. This isn't so much a reincarnation story as it is an incarnation story, a story of a child who remembers actually picking their parents. Sounds strange, right? Keep on listening because things get very weird. Judy Smith, who is now a pensioner in her 70s, says that she remembers being somewhere above the earth looking down at a gathering of pairs of people. It was then that she heard a voice in her head asking her to pick between the group, asking her to pick her parents. The voice said that they would teach her everything that she needed to know, she just needed to pick. Now she remembers this so vividly to this day, and she told her parents when she was old enough to talk that she had actually chosen them. She doesn't remember too much about the place she was in when she was choosing, only that she was high up. Her story is echoed in that of other children in the press who have claimed that they have chosen their parents in similar situations. Really weird, but I have to say, if I could choose, I would still pick my mum and dad. Here's a picture of them from the 80s before they had me. Big love.
Moving on to number 7, we have the boy who is his own grandfather. Yeah, you heard me correctly. This boy claims to be the reincarnation of his grandfather. A year before Gus Taylor was born, his grandfather had passed away. However, when the baby was 18 months, he started referring to himself as his own grandfather, Grandpa Augie. When he was 4, he could point out his grandpa in photographs despite never even seeing him before. Gus would also talk about his sister. Now, the grandfather's sister had been murdered and they always kept that from Gus, but somehow he already knew this detail and would continuously talk about his past sister. Creepy. And also super confusing. So the grandfather was the dad to Gus's mom, but his mom gave birth to her dad, the grandfather? That's so weird. Next up at number 6 we have Cameron McCauley. Now there is a short little documentary on Cameron in case you are wondering and want to check it out as well. So basically when Cameron was 2 years old, he kept saying that he had another life on a remote island called Barra. Now Cameron was from Glasgow, but Barra is an hour flight away, approximately 220 miles from Glasgow. For 3 years, Cameron kept talking about his family in Barra. He said he had brothers and sisters and even had a black and white sheepdog. He said he remembers living in a white house near the beach and remembers planes landing nearby. He even remembers the view outside from his house's window. Cameron began missing his family so much that he would become super upset. That's when they ended up going to Barra to find his home. When they did find his home, it had the same view that Cameron described and was apparently even home to the same dog. However, Cameron said he had a father named Shane Robertson that passed away from getting hit in a car. This is the one thing that doesn't check out. Apparently there was never a Shane Robertson that lived there, so who's Shane? Honestly, maybe it was his father from like 2 lives ago. Who even knows? We are now at our halfway mark with Shanti Devi. Shanti Devi was born in 1926 in India. When she was 4 years old, she started making claims about her real name, her other family, and her past life. Apparently, she told her parents that she lived 145 kilometers away in a place called Mathura with her husband Kedar Nath. She also said that she died after giving birth to her child. Apparently, she even had the same talking habits as someone from Mathura. Her family eventually took her to the other village and found the man she claimed to be her husband by the name of Kedar Nath. Kedar then told them that he did lose his wife 9 years ago, 10 days after delivering their son. Now, Kedar was skeptical of this girl's claims, so when he went to go meet Shanti, he pretended to just be his brother. But Shanti instantly recognized him as her husband from her past life. Next on my list at number 4, we have James Leanger. Born in 1998, when James was 2, he claimed to be a lieutenant and passed away when his plane was shot down. Now, just like any other parent would do, they just brushed it aside, saying that he had a wild imagination. But then he kept describing accurate information. When they researched into this plane crash, they found that there was an American pilot named Lieutenant James Houston Jr. who passed away in 1945 towards the end of World War II. First off, what are the odds that he gets reincarnated and his parents literally picked the same name? Now, the boy continued to talk about his ship, the Natoma, which was also true. He would also have reoccurring nightmares about an airplane crash. His parents then met Lieutenant James's crew, who are all old by now, but they confirmed the details that James mentioned, saying that they were all accurate and only the lieutenant and the crew could have known some of the details. Coming in at number 3, we have Edward Austrian. Edward Austrian was 4 years old when he claimed that he was a soldier from World War I. He kept saying that he passed away after taking a bullet to the throat. In fact, Edward continuously would get sore throats and would say that his shot wound was hurting. Doctors couldn't even explain why he was constantly getting these sore throats, and in fact, he even developed a cyst in his throat at one point. Eventually, the cyst mysteriously went away on its own after Edward started talking more about his past life. He claims that he was a soldier named James that was 18 years old. He has vivid memories from his past life that he would share with his family. One day he said, and I quote, "We were walking along through the mud. It was damp, it was cold. My rifle is heavy. I remember looking out and seeing trees, and then there was desolation. I heard a shot come from behind. It went through someone else, hit me square in the back of the neck, and I felt my throat fill with blood." There's no way a 4-year-old could have made up those details, especially since his parents claim that they've never let him watch any soldier or war-related movies or shows. Next up at number 2, we have the boy from Thailand. Chennai was 3 years old when he started having memories of his past life. This 3-year-old boy remembers being a teacher named Bua Kai. He talked about his previous family, wife, and children. He said that he passed away after being shot in the head while walking to school. What's freaky is that this boy has 2 birthmarks on his face. One on the back of his head and one above his left eye. Those are the exact spots where the bullet entered and exited Buakai's head. Now, people believe that birthmarks tell some sort of story from our past lives. In this case, it symbolizes how he was killed in his past. Now, Buakai was a real person that passed away about 5 years before Chennai was born. Coming in at number 1, we have the boy who solved his own murder. When a boy in Syria Golan Heights was 3, he began saying that he had been murdered in his past life. The boy said that he was killed by getting an axe to his head. This boy even had a long red birthmark on his head. In this boy's case, the birthmark also showed the way that he passed away. Now, it turns out that this boy's story checked out. They took him to the village that he said he once lived in, and even showed his family where his body was buried. When they unearthed his body, they found a boy's skeleton with an axe wound in the skeleton's skull. Like, there's no way that a kid could have just known where the body was buried by coincidence. But it doesn't stop there. The kid also remembered who the killer was and his full name. They then confronted him and he eventually admitted to the crime.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Barbro Karlin. A woman named Barbro Karlin was born in 1954 in Sweden, and by the time she could talk, she began telling her parents some pretty frightening stories. She said she could remember men kicking down the door of her home and taking her away, which is obviously quite a frightening memory for a child to be having, and one that certainly never had happened in Barbro's life at that point. She also told them a name that means a lot to us all now, but at the time, her parents had no idea who this person was. That name was Anne Frank. Anne Frank, of course, passed away in a concentration camp in 1945 after hiding in an attic with her family, trying to avoid persecution for being Jewish. Just 10 years after Anne's passing, she wasn't well known like she is today, but when Barbro was 10 years old, they took her to Amsterdam and she was able to lead them to Anne's home with no directions at all. She was then able to identify a spot on the wall where Anne had hung photos up, and she also told her parents that the steps in the home were different than she had remembered them, which held up with the history of construction that the house had already gone through. By the time she was 16, she was already writing books and poetry, and she had actually ended up going on to befriend a close relative of Anne's named Buddy Elias. Whether Barbro is a real and true reincarnation of Anne is of course to be proven for sure, but I definitely do like the idea of Anne connecting with people from her life and also having a much better life this time as Barbro. In our number 9 spot today, we have Lee. Before I dive into this one, guys, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video. It does really help us out. We appreciate it. When a child named Lee was only 2 years old, he began talking about his other house with his other mom. This would certainly be quite concerning to any parent, and by the time he was 3, he was claiming that his birthday was on June 26th, even though it was not. This continued on and Lee's claims grew and grew. He began to give even more information on what he remembers as his past life, saying that his middle name was Ko, he wrote movies for a living, he had a daughter named Jennifer, and that he had passed away at the age of 48. This is all pretty crazy for a toddler to be explaining, but instead of being frightened, Lee's parents began inquiring more and asking him even more questions. They wanted to know which movie he had written, as to possibly figure out who their son believed he had been before. His parents began to ask him titles of different movies to see if any rang a bell, and when they asked him about Gone with the Wind, Lee got very excited and said that he had definitely written that one. Lee's parents obviously quickly googled the movie to find more information, and this is when they found out about the movie's writer, Sidney Coe Howard. Sidney, of course, had the correct middle name, his birthday was June 26th, he did have a daughter named Jennifer, and he did pass away at the age of 48. My initial reaction is that his parents had possibly unknowingly fed him this information, but apparently this Google search was the first time his parents had heard any of this information, aside from hearing it from their child. This is certainly quite a crazy story, and one that may possibly have me convinced. In our number 8 spot today, we have Sergei Torop. Sergei is also known as Vissarion, and he is a Russian mystic and leader of the cult Church of the Last Testament. He also claims that in August of 1990, when he was 29 years old, he had a revelation that he was in fact the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and this led to him starting a cult. How convenient! As the leader of the cult, he is said to teach reincarnation, veganism, and harmonious human relations, predicting the end of the world. This doesn't sound too bad except for the whole thing about being Jesus, but here's the kicker. He was arrested in September of 2020 on charges of running an illegal religious organization, as well as for causing harm to others and extortion. Also, if you go on his Wikipedia page and look under the personal life section, you'll see some other weird stuff I really can't talk about on YouTube, but definitely earned him a spot on today's list. In our number 7 spot today we have John Rothwell. A man who was once named John Rothwell has since changed his name to King Arthur Pendragon because he believes he is the reincarnation of, you guessed it, King Arthur. John was once just a regular biker, but in 1986 when he learned about King Arthur, he just felt like their lives were too similar. I'm not exactly sure what similarities their lives could have held, but he was convinced. And apparently being a reincarnation of a king nowadays is very tough work. He says that when he holds his worship sessions at Stonehenge, him and his followers have to pay for parking, which is obviously something he didn't have to deal with in his former life. He even went as far as to take the tickets to court, saying that it was unfair that they were being made to pay to pray and that this infringed on his rights to worship. I mean, I'm not exactly sure the legalities of this exact situation, but the judge did end up ruling the fees as reasonable and legal, so that might just be the answer. In our number 6 spot today we have Jeffrey Keane. Jeffrey Keane had lived a lot of his life and was already retired when he started to believe in his past life. Jeffrey and his wife went on a vacation to Maryland where they visited a battlefield from the Civil War that was called Sunken Road, and that is when he became overwhelmed with emotion. Apparently the emotion was so strong that he truly thought he might be having a heart attack. After this emotion passed and he was able to gather himself, he still felt an unbelievable connection to this place. At a later date, he encountered a psychic at a party and had relayed this story to them. The psychic asked if he believed in reincarnation, and Jeffrey felt like he had to reply with the words, "Not yet." After this day, Jeffrey was reading a Civil War magazine when he came across a Civil War general named General Gordon. General Gordon had fought at Sunken Road, and during this battle, he was known for constantly shouting the words, "Not yet." This of course caused Jeffrey to do more research into the general, where he found even more connections, such as how on his 30th birthday, Jeffrey had to go to the hospital with a random, really terrible jaw pain, and when General Gordon was 30, he was shot in the jaw. Or how General Gordon had suffered certain injuries and Jeffrey had unexplained marks on his body in the same spots. This could all be coincidence, but it is definitely a very interesting story regardless. In our number 5 spot today we have Sergey Ben-Hayon. Sergey Ben-Hayon is an Australian bankrupt tennis coach who believes he is the reincarnation of famous Italian artist and scientist Leonardo da Vinci. This would be fine, except for Sergey is also the founder of a pretty harmful cult called Universal Medicine, which has been criticized for its extremely unorthodox practices and the fact that he has 0 medical qualifications. He not only has some extremely creepy and questionable practices that he says leads to the curing of cancer, but his relationship workshops that cost tens of thousands of dollars have mostly led to divorce. He also involves his daughter Natalie, and she claims that she can communicate with a woman's ovaries. A New South Wales Supreme Court jury even found that it was true that he leads a socially dangerous and socially harmful cult. In our number 4 spot today we have James Gibson. A man named James Gibson has an extremely troubled past and is actually a killer, which is truly never good, but he also believes that he is the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. I feel like even if you really felt like this, that might just be one secret I would keep to myself, but I guess James just feels differently. James really did have a difficult childhood and upbringing, which is quite sad. He lost his dad at a young age to the Black Saturday bushfires, and he got into drugs as a teenager. In 2015, he attacked and killed a man named Glenn Sullivan, and when asked why he did it, he said, "He killed my dad, I saw it in the smoke." James explained to his psychiatrist about his reincarnation belief, and he also explained that the German soldiers were controlling him and had ordered him to kill someone so that they could find him and recognize him so that they could come and retrieve him. All All in all, James has obviously had a rough go. The things he's done obviously cannot be excused, but I hope he has received some help and some treatment for everything he's got going on. In our number 3 spot today we have James Leninger. James was only 4 years old when he began to recount events from his past life. He swore that he had been a World War II pilot that had been shot down over Iwo Jima. These memories first came back when James' parents found him one night after he had woken up from a nightmare yelling, "Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out." James explained that his name in his past life was also James and that he had flown an aircraft called Natoma. His parents did some research after these claims and found that there was an aircraft carrier during World War II called the Natoma Bay, and there was a pilot who had been killed in action in this plane over the Pacific named James Houston. They began to ask him questions about his past life, including questions about the airplane that would have been truly surprising for a small child to have the answers to. Like when his mom referred to an object on the bottom of a toy plane as a bomb, and James responded by correcting her, telling her it was a drop tank. Or when one day they were all watching a documentary on the History Channel and the narrator of the show referred to a plane as a Zero, and James said that was untrue and it was actually a Tony. I have no idea what any of this means, but apparently James was right both times. This is obviously a pretty unbelievable story, and many people think James just took an interest in World War II and planes at a young age and had been exposed to this information previously, but his parents swear that just isn't true. In our number 2 spot today we have Lee. When a child named Lee was only 2 years old, he began talking about his other house with his other mom. This would certainly be quite concerning to any parent, and by the time he was 3, he was claiming that his birthday was on June 26th, even though it was not. This continued on, and Lee's claims grew and grew. He began to give more information on what he remembers as his past life, saying that his middle name was Ko, he wrote movies for a living, he had a daughter named Jennifer, and that he had passed away at the age of 48. This is all pretty crazy for a toddler to be explaining, but instead of being frightened, Lee's parents began inquiring more and asking him more questions. They wanted to know which movie he had written, as to possibly figure out who their son believed he had been before. His parents began to ask him titles of different movies to see if any rang a bell, and when they asked him about Gone with the Wind, Lee got very excited and said that he had definitely written that one. Lee's parents obviously quickly googled the movie to find out more information, and this is when they found out about the movie's writer, Sidney Ko Howard. Sidney of course had the correct middle name. His birthday was June 26th, he did have a daughter named Jennifer, and he did pass away at the age of 48. My initial reaction is that his parents had possibly unknowingly fed him this information, but apparently this Google search was the first time his parents had heard any of this information, aside from hearing it from their child. This is certainly quite a crazy story, and one that may possibly have me convinced. In our number 1 spot today we have Barbro Carlin. A woman named Barbro Carlin was born in 1954 in Sweden, and by the time she could talk, she began telling her parents some pretty frightening stories. She said she could remember men kicking down the door of her home and taking her away, which is obviously quite a frightening memory for a child to be having, and one that had certainly never happened in Barbro's life at that point. She also told them a name that means a lot to all of us now, but at the time, her parents had no idea who this person was. That name was Anne Frank. Anne Frank, of course, passed away in a concentration camp in 1945 after hiding in an attic with her family, trying to avoid persecution for being Jewish. Just 10 years after Anne's passing, she wasn't well known like she is today, but when Barbara was 10 years old, her family took her to Amsterdam, and she was able to lead them to Anne's home with no directions at all. She was then able to identify a spot on the wall where Anne had hung photos up, and she also told her parents that the steps in the home were different than she had remembered them, which held up with the history of construction that the house had gone through. By the time she was 16, she was already writing books and poetry, and she actually ended up going on to befriend a close relative of Anne's named Buddy Elias. Whether Barbro is a real and true reincarnation of Anne is of course to be proven for sure, but I definitely do like the idea of Anne connecting with people from her life and also having a much better life this time as Barbro.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have The General. In 2015, retired Fire Chief Jeffrey Keane came across evidence which he suggested was proof that he was Civil War General John B. Gordon in a past life. Yeah, not everyone can say that. While visiting a Civil War battlefield, he was inexplicably overcome with emotion and had trouble breathing. At one point, he even thought he was having a heart attack. A while later, he spoke to a psychic. As they talked, he felt compelled to say the words, "Not yet." For no reason. He didn't know why he said those two words. Later on though, he found a Civil War magazine, and while flicking through it, the words "not yet" in quotation marks sort of jumped out at him. It was quoting the words of General Gordon, who said them while telling his troops to stay back during a battle on the exact same part of the battlefield where Jeffrey felt like he was having that heart attack. The picture of the general in the magazine also looked a lot like him. It gets weirder though. When Jeffrey turned 30, he went to hospital with an immense pain in his jaw and face. No cause was found. Sure enough, when investigators looked through General Gordon's life, he was shot in the face when he was 30 years old. It could all be a coincidence, but it's pretty strange, don't you think? Next up at number 9 now, we have the Golden Age. Ryan Hammonds was a boy who, at the age of 4, began having nightmares of people and places he didn't recognize. After a few months, he began to describe the details of this. It sounded like he was remembering the Golden Age of Hollywood. Cindy became concerned that there was more to Ryan's nightmares than initially thought. Cindy looked through a book about Hollywood and was amazed when Ryan pointed to a man in a photo and calmly said it was him in a past life. A child psychologist interviewed Ryan and found that he accurately described about 55 details of the man in the photo, an actor and Hollywood agent who had died in 1964. One creepy thing that stood out was that first they thought Ryan had got the age of death wrong for this guy called Marty. He said that he was 61 when he died, the death certificate said 59, but it turns out that the death certificate was actually wrong and Ryan was right the whole time. How could he have known that? That's kind of weird. Coming in number 8 now, we have The Grandfather. This is a story of a boy called Sam who was studied by Dr. Jim B. Tucker of the University of Virginia. Now when Sam was 4 years old, his grandmother died. On that day, his father brought out an old photo album. Sam had never seen a picture of his grandfather before. When Sam saw a picture of his grandfather's first car, he pointed to it and said, "That's my car." When they showed him a picture of his granddad and some of his friends from when he was a boy, Sam pointed right to his grandfather and said, "There I am." They told him, "No, that's your grandfather." He said again, "No, that's me." He then began to share a lot of details that were creepily accurate. One that stood out was when he turned to his mother one day and said that in his past life, as his grandfather, someone had turned his sister into a fish. They asked him, who? He said, bad men. His grandfather's sister had actually been murdered and her corpse was dumped in a body of water. Is this proof of his reincarnation or a little bit of a stretch? I'll be interested to hear your opinions on this one.
Moving on to number 7, we have deja vu. Have you ever experienced deja vu? You know, the feeling that you've already done something before or that you're reliving a moment? Well, according to a number of researchers, deja vu is a sign you are reincarnated. Maybe you are experiencing it because you actually have done whatever it is that you're doing before in your past life. It can be triggered by smells, sounds, sights, tastes, etc. It could be you are feeling that way because you are reliving a moment from your past life. The term deja vu literally means already seen. Apply that to reincarnation and bam! You have already seen or done it before in your past life. A number of people in history have claimed they learned about their past lives simply through deja vu. For example, let's say you were painting something and then you experienced this deja vu. Well, maybe that's because you were a painter in your past life. If you continue on learning about painting and art, maybe more memories will be triggered and you'll find out more about your past life. In our 6th spot, we have the birthmarks. If you've seen my other videos on reincarnation, then you know that it's believed that our moles or birthmarks tell the story of our past lives. Ian Stevenson, MD, decided to interview hundreds of kids who remembered their past lives. Then from those kids, he documented 200 children that had birthmarks that corresponded to the wounds they experienced in their past life. For example, there was one boy who remembered dying after being shot in the head. Well, this kid had a birthmark on the front of his head and on the back, presumably where the bullet entered and exited. Then you have a girl who remembered being struck 3 times with an axe on her back. Well, on her back she had 3 linear birthmarks. Pretty eerie. Not only that, he realized that 35% of those children had phobias relating to the way that they died. For example, if they remember drowning in their past lives, then they were afraid of water in their current life. It's insane. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the killer. When this next boy learned how to talk properly, he would tell his mom stories on how he was actually a man named Selim Fesley. He claimed that he lived in a nearby village and died one day after being shot in the right ear by his neighbor. In fact, this boy was born with a deformed right ear. He was also able to identify his previous wife and even visited her. And also, he visited his killer and got him to confess to the murder of him. That's crazy. Imagine a little 5-year-old solving his own murder, literally coming back to life to make sure that his killer is caught. In our 4th spot, we have Dr. Semke. Dr. Semke in 1984 decided to visit a medium to find out about his past life. After doing so, he discovered that he felt connected to the 2nd president of the United States, John Adams. The medium then encouraged him to learn more about John, and the more he did, the more he remembered his past life as him. In the end, he realized that not only did he and Adams physically look similar, but they also have several of the same personality traits. I wonder who I was in my past life. I just hope it was someone famous as well. In our 3rd spot, we have the fears and phobias. Scientists believe that any fear or phobia that we develop has to do with our past life experiences. But it's not the common fears like fear of heights, snakes, spiders, etc. That's related to a basic desire that we all have to survive. We're talking about the more irrational fears, like fear of flying. Maybe in your past life you were involved in an airplane crash, or fear of water. Maybe you drowned in your past life. The more uncommon phobias might say something about how you died in your past life. In our 2nd spot, we have the unexplainable pain. Some people experience random body pain that impacts their daily life. After undergoing a number of treatments, procedures, and examinations, doctors still are like, we don't know what's wrong with you. Well, the answer might be found in their past life. Some researchers believe that any constant unexplainable pain you feel might be related to your past life. Maybe in your past life you suffered from a bad injury. This transferred on with you in your new life. That's why doctors are like, I don't know what's causing this pain. Well, it's from a past life injury. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the brothers. Now this one is a heartwarming story, but it starts with a pretty sad one. Several years ago, a boy named Kevin Christensen passed away from cancer. Kevin also had a nodule above his right ear, clouding in his left eye, and he would walk with a limp. And due to the chemotherapy he went through, he had a scar on the right side of his neck. Sadly, Kevin lost his battle to cancer. 12 years later, Patrick Christensen was born. What was odd was that Patrick had a birthmark on his neck, on the right side, just like the scar his brother had. He would also walk with a limp, despite nothing being wrong with him or his legs. Not only that, when he was 4 years old, he asked his mom about some surgery he remembered. His mom was all like, sweetie, you never went through any surgery. But Patrick was adamant that he did have surgery, and then he pointed to his ear, the same spot where Kevin was operated on. Patrick then said that he would remember more about this surgery, but he was asleep when it happened, much like how Kevin was put to sleep during the operation. So it's believed that Patrick is the reincarnation of his brother Kevin.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Ryan. A boy named Ryan was born in 2005, and when he was just 4 years old, he began waking up, clutching his chest, and screaming about his heart exploding in Hollywood. Okay, not really normal behavior for a 4-year-old, and definitely something to look into. After this, Ryan began to share more details with his parents about a life he says he can remember living. As it turns out, Ryan believes that he is the reincarnation of a famous Hollywood talent agent, Marty Martin, who passed away around 50 years before Ryan was born. Ryan claimed things like how he had 2 sisters, one of which was a dancer, and that his mother had curly brown hair, and all of this was true to the life of Martin. He also claimed that he lived on a street that had rock in the name, and Martin lived on a street called Roxbury. Eventually, this all led to Ryan meeting Martin's daughter in real life, and apparently Ryan was extremely standoffish during the meeting, and after, he told his mother that his daughter's energy had changed. A psychiatrist who specifically researches reincarnation has said that meeting people from their past life who have moved on can offer them closure and causes them to forget their former life. This is definitely an interesting thought. I really wonder what happened here for sure. Moving on to number 9, we have Helen Smith. A woman who was born in 1861 by the name of Catherine Mueller ended up changing her name to Helen Smith, and she believed she was reincarnated from the French Queen Marie Antoinette, as well as a reincarnation of an Arabic sheikh and also the wife of a Hindu prince. This This is a lot of claims, and I honestly didn't know that people would be able to remember multiple past lives. She spent her whole life working as a spiritual medium, and she said she could receive messages from unseen creatures. She also said that she could communicate with Martians and knew the language that was spoken on Mars, sometimes even writing this language down. She also drew what she said Mars looked like, which included boats and houses and plants and lakes. Considering it is highly, highly unlikely that Mars had any of these things, I think I'm having a hard time believing this one, but I'm sure in the late 1800s and early 1900s, she certainly would have had many people fooled. In our number 8 spot today, we have Sonam Wangdu. In 1991, Sonam Wangdu was born in Seattle, and by the time he was 2 years old, he knew that he was the reincarnation of the Tibetan Lama Daeshung Rinpoche, the first. What's crazy is that the third reincarnation of Daeshung Rinpoche, who passed away in 1987, said before his passing that he would be reincarnated in Seattle. In 1996, Sonam had already changed his name to Trula, which means reincarnation, and he was leaving his family forever to go and be raised by monks while he studied Tibetan Buddhism in Kathmandu, Nepal. This is where he eventually became the head of a monastery. In 2016, he was asked how long he would stay in Nepal, and he just said, lots of time. He is still there and still continues to live as the fourth reincarnation of Daeshung Rinpoche.
Coming in at number 7, we have The Truck. Dr. Wayne Dyer wrote a book about reincarnation called Memories of Heaven. Make of that what you will, but some of the stories are pretty interesting. In that book, he shared the disturbing story of mother Els van Poppel. Els had a son who was nearing his 2nd birthday when he said something extremely disturbing as they were about to cross the road. He gripped his mother's hand and said, "Careful, or else I will die again." His mother was so shocked by what her son said, but he wasn't done. He continued by saying, "Remember when I was little and I fell and my head was on the road and the truck drove over it." Jesus, that really takes the biscuit of creepy things that kids could say. Well, now Els was absolutely sure that her son had never had a nightmare like this, nor had he actually seen anything like this on television that might have been similar. Dr. Wayne Dyer also shared the next story in his book. We have The Foreign Mother. Now this story is about his own daughter. Serena Dyer would often talk in her sleep. At first her parents thought she was speaking nonsense until they listened harder and realized that actually she was talking another language. One night she woke up shouting in this other language and her mother went to comfort her. In a dazed and confused state, Serena said, "You're not my real mother. I have a real mother that I remember, but it's not you." Imagine hearing that, honestly, that's so heartbreaking, and also, what is going on? One more short creepy story from Dr. Wayne's book that I really want to mention because it is so scary. We have The Child Mum at number 5. It seems that mother Suzanne Robinson was tired one day. Honestly, looking after kids can be super exhausting, and I'm saying that and I don't even have them, so imagine if you did and I don't know, they're there all the time, they want attention and you just want a nap. So anyway, Suzanne fell asleep, which I think is totally understandable. She was looking after her 3-year-old daughter at the time, and she woke up to her daughter stroking her hair in a very, very maternal and caring way. When Suzanne came round, her daughter said, "Don't you remember? I used to be your mother." "What are you talking about?" "No, you didn't, you're my child." Okay, let's take a light break from all this intensity, shall we? All of these stories have been really, really, really intense, but I feel like I need a little splash of breathing space. At number 4, I really want to talk about how Nicolas Cage is either reincarnated or is legit a time traveler. Either works. Have a look at Nicolas Cage. Here he is in all of his glory. What a man, what an actor. Well, here is a Civil War man from Tennessee who is also actually Nicolas Cage. Hello there, Southern States Cage. How you doing? The image surfaced after an eBay seller attempted to sell the 1870s portrait on the auction site. Now in the description, they claimed that Nicolas Cage was a vampire. Of course, logical explanation. David Letterman even asked Cage about it on his show and he denied it. Okay, maybe he isn't a vampire, but he is the spit of this guy, so I'm saying he was probably reincarnated. Okay, back to the intensity. Coming in at number 3, we have The Bridge. Back in 1994, a woman went on the Oprah Winfrey Show to talk about her daughter Leah. It seems when Leah was just 2 years old, she was in the car seat of her mother's car and the pair were driving over a bridge. As they were driving, she suddenly exclaimed, "This is just like where I died." What? Her mother, of course, was extremely shocked, but her daughter explained it all in a matter-of-fact detail. Have a listen.
I said, "Well, who was driving the car then?" And she said, "I was big. I could reach the pedals." And she has no clue that you need pedals to drive a car. She's 2, she's in the car seat.
I legit do not know what I would do if somebody said that to me. It seems her daughter was telling her that she was in an accident where she drove off a bridge and drowned. Her mother pressed her further and she said that she wasn't wearing a seatbelt when she drove off the bridge. Then she said this.
I was laying on the rocks. I could feel the rocks on my head. And she said, and see the shiny bridge. And she points up, she's looking up. And she doesn't see the shiny bridge and the bubbles going up.
Honestly, that is terrifying. This is a very interesting story at number 2. We have the boy from Barra. Now, Barra is a small island in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. Cameron Macaulay from Glasgow was absolutely convinced that he'd lived there despite never actually having been. Ever since he was able to talk, he told his family members that his mother on Barra, other mother, must be missing him. At first, his mum was totally weirded out by it, but she didn't think too much of it because, you know, kids and their imaginations. But then he started describing his life in very accurate detail. He said he lived in a white house with 3 toilets and that he had a black and white dog and his family owned a black car. He said that he had a mother with long brown hair and his dad had died from quote unquote not looking both ways. He also explained the beach of Barra in super great detail. His parents decided in the end that enough was enough. They actually believed him. They were gonna take Cameron to Barra to find the house. They went to Barra and you know what? They did find the house, but there was a different family living there than Cameron remembered. That being said, he knew his way around it and it did indeed have 3 bathrooms. The beach was also exactly as Cameron had described. Eventually, the family traced a distant relative of a family who had previously lived in the home. Now, that family had a black car and a black and white dog. Creepy. Finally, so creepy, so weird, I don't know what I would do. At number 1, we have the Nazi pilot. Imagine your child starts drawing swastikas. Disturbing, right? Well, they probably don't know what it means, but then imagine asking him what they were drawing and then discovering that your child could well be the reincarnation of a Nazi Luftwaffe bomber. Like words, I don't have words for this. Val Eden noticed that her 5-year-old son was drawing eagles and then a swastika. When she asked what he was drawing, he replied totally innocently that he was drawing his badges. It seemed that when he was younger he would also wake up from terrible nightmares in which he said his leg was missing after a plane disaster. Of course that's super weird and really vivid for a 2-year-old. When he was 6, his dad found a picture of a plane cockpit in his son's room and little Carl was able to pinpoint in exact detail all of the gauges, levers and pedals, including the one that would drop a bomb. It seems that his nightmares came back and got even more vivid as he got older. He could explain his dreams now. He said that the engine of his plane had died, he opened a hatch to try and get out, but his right leg was gone. The boy had a red birthmark on his right leg. Strange. When his parents pressed Carl, he was able to explain his exact uniform. He said he was in the Air Force, and also he was able to explain the exact model of warplane that he was flying. His obsession with his past life grew, and he would describe to people at school how his former father Fritz would teach him about flowers and trees. He also said he was supposed to marry a woman from his village and he was sad when he died because he couldn't. On a side note, it seemed that actually a few Luftwaffe bomber planes had come down near where the Eden family were living in Middlesbrough. Now this had all happened in England in 1942 and 3 bodies were found. Fast forward a few years, Carl actually ended up being murdered as a young adult. His story is super crazy and so worth looking into if you can. You don't have time in this video to uncover all of the ins and outs of it. It's worth an hour-long video just of its own. Like I said, it is so interesting. I will say though, researchers may have uncovered the lost body of a German pilot that he thought he was. Now this was all happening a few years after Carl's death. It seems that there was a 4th body that was found decades later from another plane that had come down with the others in 1942. The body was identified as Heinrich Richter. Here's a picture of him. Now, here's a picture of Carl as an adult. They bear more than a passing resemblance. I for one, actually, am quite convinced.